So, you've seen a two-in-one laptop before. You know, the one that switches between laptop mode and tablet mode when you tilt the screen 180 degrees around. Well, what happens when you add a little bit of gaming DNA to that? Well, that's what you're looking at, my friends. Meet the ROG Flow X13. You see, this is a device that takes everything about portable gaming to a whole new level. And ASUS was able to do this by introducing an ecosystem that basically allows you to expand your performance profile to something unique that you wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve with a traditional Ultrabook and a GPU dock via Thunderbolt. In fact, we've made a separate video discussing the setup and its complexities, which you can check out right over here. I remember that time when Mike just had to break his head trying to make things work, but it's definitely worth checking out if you're really interested. Now, the Flow X13 has one of the fastest processors on the planet, a GPU that's good enough to game wherever you go, and if you need a little bit of power, actually if you need a lot of power, you can hook up an RTX 3080 via this portable mobile dock called the XG Mobile. And the best part is that it's so seamless to a point where you don't have to worry about drivers or restarting the system or just fiddling around with different issues that you might experience with a Thunderbolt dock. It just works, guys. And I'm super excited to talk about my experience, but also mention some of the concerns. But first, a quick word from our sponsor.
You have a 1200 watt power supply in there? Yep. And the triple slot RTX 3090? Sure, it will fit if you find one. And the 240mm radiator? This, my friends, is the new Sugo 14 and 15 from Silverstone. The microwave, the ITX case you need for a no compromise build under 20 liters. Check it out below.
All right, so let's start off with the Flow X13. You see, this thing is a portable gaming Ultrabook that's meant to compete against something like the Razer Blade Stealth 13. The specs inside this device might give the Blade a run for its money because it's got AMD's Ryzen 9 5980HS processor with 8 cores and 16 threads. Keep in mind that we have the Supernova edition that unfortunately you can't actually buy at the moment, but the standard edition comes with the 5900HS CPU. The rest of the specs are pretty much identical. You've got 16 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte NVMe SSD, 120 Hz, 1200p display, and a GTX 1650. All for $1,500. Now the sample that we have over here has twice the memory and a 60 Hz 4K display. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what pricing is for this particular variant, but something to keep in mind is that this device just goes out of stock every time, and ASUS is trying to restock it every other day. I did check it this morning and it was in stock, but when you guys are probably watching this, it might be out of stock. It's just the current scarcity climate, you know, that's unfortunately where we're in right now. It's just really tough to get hands-on with this device. That's just something to keep note of. So make sure you constantly check the website. Again, you might be lucky. As for the XG Mobile with the RTX 3080 GPU, you're looking at an additional $1,500, which in total would cost you about $3,000 with the Flow X13, and that's a lot of money. But if you do plan on buying them as a bundle, you'll save about $200, which is a pretty good deal in my opinion. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you do find them in stock. Now, if you look at the overall design of the X13, ASUS has done a nice job keeping it stealth with the exterior and interior. The top lid comes with these textured lines across the surface that gives the user a little bit of grip to hold on to when traveling. It also does a great job resisting fingerprints, and the hinge is pretty strong for a two-in-one device. It exhibits a little bit of wobble, but it's nothing to be worried about. The interior space follows the same design language as the exterior. I like the matte black texture. And the keyboard layout is pretty standard given this size. You get extra buttons to access Armoury Crate, control the volume levels, and mute the microphone. The keys themselves are excellent. It actually reminded me of the Zephyrus G15 that I looked at recently, so key travel is adequate for those who type a lot, and it's just a very satisfying feel when you bottom out. They are LED backlit in white, which is an odd choice to be honest, because typically with ROG laptops, ASUS just loves to throw in Aura RGB lighting, but in this case, you're just getting something standard. However, I did wish if it got brighter. The trackpad is decent. It's not the smoothest surface that I worked on, especially compared to the Razer Blade Stealth 13, and it's pretty small too, but I will say that the integrated primary left and right buttons sound excellent, nice and tactile, but also something else that I should mention is that this trackpad picks up finger oil easily, so you will have to constantly remind yourself to clean it once in a while if you like to keep your devices clean. I'm not sure how many of you fall into that category, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. Overall, from a build quality standpoint, ASUS has done a really good job with the Flow X13. There were no signs of creaking within the chassis, given that it's made out of magnesium alloy instead of an all aluminum construction. It's also lighter than the Blade Stealth 13, coming in at just under 3 pounds, and it's only 0.62 inches thick, so it's very convenient to travel with. So this is the webcam test on the Flow X13 by ROG. What's really interesting is that this is one of the first laptops in a really long time from ROG featuring webcams. So there's that. The quality is pretty good. The microphone sounds pretty good as well. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. At least, the fact that we get a webcam is kind of nice. The speakers are located at the bottom, so naturally you will compromise on audio fidelity, especially with the trebles. There is a little bit of bass, but it's nothing mind-blowing, guys. Overall, it gets a job done for the form factor. The X13 comes with a 4K IPS 60Hz display, and given that it has a 16:10 aspect ratio, you get some more vertical screen real estate to work with different applications. And the quality of this panel is great. For my display analysis test, it covers 99% sRGB, 80% Adobe RGB, and 86% DCI-P3. So it's great for editing photos and maybe a little bit of content creation, given that it has a discrete GPU. Brightness levels are respectable. It only peaks to about 390 nits, and this display is covered with Corning Gorilla Glass, which interestingly does a pretty good job cutting out a lot of the reflections, especially in extremely bright environments, which is really cool. And let's not forget, this is a 2-in-1 device, so you can use this in tablet mode and interact with the content in a more lively manner. Plus, it also features touch support, so you can use the included stylus to jot down notes or doodle around if that's something that you're into. One thing I would strongly recommend is that you pick the 120Hz 1200p display over the 4K 60Hz option, simply because gaming at 60Hz is an eyesore, especially in 2021. And the GTX 1650 inside this laptop isn't powerful enough to drive modern games at that resolution. Plus, you save a lot of money too. Port selection, unfortunately, is very limited on the X13. As you can see on the right-hand side, there is a USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2 port with support for PD charging, and it supports DisplayPort output. There's also a full-size USB Gen 2 port and a power button, which also acts as a fingerprint reader. Switching over to the other side, you'll see a little silicone cover that covers the proprietary jack for the XG Mobile. This cover can be easily misplaced, so it's something to keep track of, and you can see that there is another USB-C port, giving you a total of 2 on the X13. Next to that is an HDMI 2.0 port and an audio jack. Now, it's not the worst setup that I've come across, but if you need to connect other peripherals or external accessories, you will need to invest in a hub. But if you do end up picking up the XG Mobile, you just automatically get access to a bunch of ports, like 4 USB Type-A's, an extra HDMI 2.0 port, a full-size display port, an RJ45 jack, and a UHS 3 full-size card reader. I mean, ASUS, bravo. You really have thought about implementing the best ports, or I guess most amount of ports, in a device that's a lot smaller than external GPUs. That's just crazy. Now, speaking of the XG Mobile, it's a pretty compact module that can easily be carried over from one place to another. The build quality is not the greatest, and it's mostly made out of plastic components, and it stands up on the desk through this built-in kickstand that's integrated within the unit. Keep in mind that once you have this plugged into the Flow X13, it actually passes power to the laptop, so there's no need to connect the power cable that comes with the laptop separately. So that clears an extra USB Type-C port on the side, which is nice. Setting it up is super simple, and ASUS has actually given a lot of thought process into this. So first, you need to plug in the power cable to the dock. Then you plug in the proprietary connector to the X13, and then you lock it with the switch located on top. You will then get a pop-up notification asking whether or not if you want to connect the XG Mobile to the X13. Once you click OK, you just have to wait for about a minute, and then you're good to go. Just make sure you deactivate the device by clicking the icon tray on your taskbar before unplugging the connector. It's just crazy to think how much power you can get from such a compact setup, because it's significantly smaller in size compared to some of the other external GPU docks that I've taken a look at. But there are a few issues that I did run into. First up, randomly my external drives just won't be recognized, especially storage devices. Other times, the video output wouldn't be detected if the peripheral is plugged in. Then there's the magnet for the kickstand that got pushed its way out of the chassis, and it's now sitting on the inside flap. And finally, I noticed that the laptop just wouldn't go to sleep when you have this thing plugged in. So, to be honest, I was expecting some quirks to come with this first-gen product, but I do want to spend some time and talk about the future of this ecosystem, because this is a cool product. It's a cool, sort of setup. It's a great start. It's very unique, but I'm not sure if ASUS is going to support this in the future. Are they going to roll out an updated Flow X13 with faster CPU or faster specs? Are they going to roll out an XG Mobile with RTX 4080 if NVIDIA launches that later on? These are some of the questions that are up in the air, and like I said, I really hope they take this and sort of build upon that foundation. I wouldn't invest in this ecosystem in the hopes of upgrading down the future, because there's just no guarantee, and yeah, that's just something to keep note of. Upgradability on the Flow X13 is pretty restricted. As you can see, the memory is soldered onto the PCB, and the only component that's used or upgradable is the M.2 NVMe SSD. Now this one is an M.2 2230 spec, so you can't actually swap it out for the standard 2280 spec. The drive speeds are okay. It's not the fastest that I've seen, but it'll get the job done. Now, what about battery life? Well, remember, the Flow X13 is a slim and light laptop, but it also houses one of the, if not the most powerful mobile processors. But it also has a pretty small battery than a lot of the other laptops we've seen from ASUS at just 62 watt-hours. So there's definitely some sacrifices. As you can see, while about 10.5 hours is pretty good, it doesn't actually come anywhere close to some of the other modern gaming laptops that are able to deliver. It's also pretty low for a thin and light category as well. Under a heavier load, this laptop only lasts just a little over 2 hours, even though the Ryzen 9 5980HS gets downclocked to a much lower power level. It would be really interesting to see how the standard 5900HS model does here, since that one's supposed to be operating at a bit lower power level. And speaking of power levels, I need to set up the stage for you guys a little bit, because this one's going to be an odd one. But it also highlights the problems that we're facing with the laptop market right now. And the main issue is performance isn't necessarily determined by the name of the CPU anymore, because it all comes down to how much power the laptop funnels to the processor and how it's cooled. For example, a Ryzen 9 5900HS running at 45 watts will typically be able to sustain better frequencies than a 5980HS running at just 40 watts. You might pay a little bit more for the faster or the higher spec CPU, but that necessarily won't give you better performance by any way, because as I mentioned earlier, it all ultimately comes down to how much power you can put in to the CPU. So let's see how this all translates into the Flow X13 and compare it to the 5900HS in ASUS's own Zephyrus G15. Temperatures are actually quite well managed here, at least in performance mode, where the CPU barely gets above 80 degrees. But there is a dip at the 6-minute mark, and you'll see why soon. On the other hand, turbo mode sees a gradual increase to the point where things get pretty toasty, but still very short of AMD's throttle temperature of 105 degrees. Adding the G15 here really gives another perspective, since its performance mode pegs temperatures above 90 for a few minutes, and then it normalizes them down to a more reasonable point. You can actually see how power modulation in all three modes pretty much directly lines up with the dips in temperature. Performance mode only pushes the 5980HS to 42 watts, after which it gets tugged all the way back down to 35 watts, while turbo mode gives it a bit more juice to work with. And when you add the G15's 5900HS, you'll see what I was talking about just a few seconds ago. Even in performance mode, it's allowed to chuck down a lot more power than the Flow's 5980HS, and it keeps a really constant level all the way towards the end of the test. And all of that translates into some really interesting clock speed comparisons, where we can literally see the effect of power on the Flow's overall performance. A dip in power means lower clocks. It's just as simple as that, guys. But with the G15, it basically just overtakes the Flow when it comes to frequencies during an all-core load, and that'll lead to the 5900HS walking all over the 5980HS in many situations. Look, I know I'm comparing a thin and light laptop to something that's thicker, but it's an important element when it comes to making that purchasing decision, because it highlights why you shouldn't assume that a higher-end CPU or GPU will get you better performance, especially on laptops. There's just a lot more variables than that. So either way, let's just see how all of these results or overtime results translates to real-world benchmarks. And as we go through these, you'll notice that just like the clock speed suggested, the 5980HS in the Flow X13 just can't keep up with the G15 in multi-core loads. But then again, it isn't meant to either. As a matter of fact, This is the fastest thin and light laptop we've tested by a long shot. I should also mention that the 5900HS version will probably be just as fast since ASUS is running it at the same power limits. Moving on to programs that use the CPU and GPU for acceleration, and of course, the X13 with its external dock is seriously powerful. Not only that, but the 5980HS's strong single-threaded performance can flex its muscles here as well. Now, what isn't being flexed is the GTX 1650, especially in Resolve. It just doesn't have the horsepower to keep up with the faster GPUs here, but it still gets the job done. But I think the biggest selling point about this laptop is, again, this external GPU dock. It just allows the X13 to be super mobile, but also, need that extra horsepower with the ability to game at super high levels when you have this thing plugged in. Not only that, but the space within the XG dock allows ASUS to run the RTX 3080 mobile GPU near its maximum power limit in turbo mode and all the way up to 120 watts in performance. Clock speeds are right up there too and are way higher than any other notebook-based 3080 I've seen so far. I just wish we could control the performance mode of the external dock separately from the laptop, since it would allow for a much more adaptable experience. The only exception is silent mode, which starts off pretty well, but then it gets pounded as it starts to throttle. Temperatures are really well managed too without anything to worry about, but I guess that's expected since ASUS didn't need to work within the typical laptop thermal constraints here. As for gaming performance, well, first of all, the GTX 1650 really isn't designed for this type of gaming, guys, but it still delivers some playable frame rates. The only reason it fails in some games is its 4 GB of memory just isn't enough for our settings. The RTX 3080 external card, though, that needs a bit of explanation since the results are a bit all over the place, at least at 1080p. A lot of that seems to be due to CPU bottlenecks because in the games where GPU horsepower matters, it just flies. You can actually see this in the 1440p results where the Flow plus external dock walks all over the Zephyrus G15. I mean, guys, this is getting near high-end desktop performance levels. 4K pushes things even further. And just to give you a little bit of an idea, some of these results are within just 15% of our main test system with a Ryzen 9 5900X and an RTX 3070. That's just crazy. As for acoustic performance, the X13 by itself is pretty silent, but when you factor in the XG Mobile with the RTX 3080, it does tend to get really loud. And surface temperatures on both units are tolerable. Just watch out for the exhaust area on the XG Mobile. It's practically a mini heater when you put it under load. So here are my final thoughts for the ROG Flow X13. You see, for $1,500, just getting this laptop itself is a great value, especially when you consider what you're getting and what you're up against. Because while our sample has the 5980HS, even with the 5900HS, it still has one of the fastest mobile processors on the market, especially in this form factor. You also get great build quality, decent battery life, and it gets the job done for light gaming. In a lot of ways, this is like the Razer Blade Stealth 13, but with a much better CPU and a lower price. You see, this is a really good thin and light laptop itself, but when you link it up to this external 3080, it just flies. I mean, the performance, you've seen it at high resolutions. I mean, when you connect this thing to a secondary display, you just get incredible frame rates. And the fact that you get additional I/O is just the icing on top of the cake. But here's the question. Would I buy the ROG Flow X13 alone when you factor out the XG Mobile? Well, I'm still on the fence about that. I mean, sure, this thing is a really good thin and light laptop, but it does have some connectivity limitations, especially when it comes to ports. And there are some serious questions about how long will ASUS actually end up supporting this ecosystem, because it's a proprietary connector and this dock alone is just, I'm not exactly sure if they're going to discontinue this after this year, or maybe they might update it. It's just a question mark, and I don't know where to take it from there. So, like I said, it's a great start. It's very unique. And, when you spend about $3,000 for this entire thing, it's pricey, but hey, it's geared towards a very specific niche market. It's not for everyone. It's very niche. And I respect ASUS for trying something new. So on that note, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys were able to take away something from this video. Stay safe and spend responsibly, my friends.